On a quiet September morning in Kentucky, the sanctity of a courthouse was shattered inside the chambers of Judge Kevin Mullins. What began as an ordinary day of legal proceedings ended with the fatal shooting of a respected judge, carried out by a man who once wore the badge of sheriff. Former lawman Sean "Mickey" Steins entered the judge's chambers, a space regarded as private and secure, and within minutes turned it into the scene of a deliberate killing. Surveillance cameras captured the fateful encounter. The footage revealed the two men engaged in what seemed to be a routine discussion, their words muted by the lens, but their familiarity apparent. Then, without warning, Steins reached for his firearm. In a moment that stunned investigators and observers alike, he fired point blank into Judge Mullins, striking him multiple times. The attack was as sudden as it was decisive, leaving no chance for defense or escape.
The courtroom community recoiled at the revelation. A judge's chambers, long considered a symbol of order and safety, had become the setting of lawlessness. Prosecutors emphasized from the earliest stages that this was not an accident, nor an act of confusion, but a calculated act of violence carried out by a sworn protector of the law. The tragedy extended beyond the courthouse walls. Judge Mullins' family, including his daughters, became a constant presence at subsequent hearings, their grief and composure reminding all in attendance that the case was not merely about statutes and procedure, but about profound human loss. For the public, the crime symbolized a deep betrayal. An officer who once pledged to uphold justice had extinguished the life of the very man sworn to interpret it. Sean "Mickey" Steins was once regarded as a figure of authority and trust in Letcher County, Kentucky. As the elected sheriff, he carried the responsibilities of enforcing the law, protecting citizens, and upholding the standards of justice. For many residents, his badge symbolized safety and respect. Yet beneath the uniform lay a history that prosecutors would later argue revealed darker motives and a troubled past. Steins' career began with promise, known for his ability to connect with locals and his strong presence in community affairs. He positioned himself as both lawman and neighbor, but behind the scenes, cracks in his reputation began to surface. Allegations of misconduct, financial troubles, and strained professional relationships gradually eroded the image of the trusted sheriff. Reports suggested that his ties with Judge Kevin Mullins had grown tense, fueled by court decisions and legal disputes that did not favor Steins or his allies. The former sheriff's personal life mirrored the turbulence of his professional one. Struggles with control, temper, and authority were noted by those who interacted with him closely. These factors, when combined with his legal and financial pressures, painted the picture of a man whose career was collapsing and whose identity as a law enforcer was slipping away. Prosecutors highlighted these aspects to demonstrate that the killing of Judge Mullins was not a spontaneous outburst, but the culmination of long brewing resentment. They argued that Steins' authority as sheriff had been challenged, his respect diminished, and his pride wounded. For the defense, however, the same background was framed differently, pointing to years of service, dedication, and a respected career overshadowed by one tragic decision. By the time he entered Judge Mullins' chambers, Sean "Mickey" Steins was no longer the admired sheriff of earlier years. He was a man facing the wreckage of reputation, wrestling with failures, and, according to the state, motivated by vengeance. At the center of the trial lay a piece of evidence that needed no words: the security camera footage from inside Judge Mullins' chambers. The video, played multiple times before the jury, became the single most compelling witness of the crime. With no sound to accompany it, every gesture, glance, and movement carried weight as prosecutors and defense attorneys worked to shape its meaning. The recording begins with what appears to be a calm exchange. Judge Mullins is seated, reviewing documents, while Sean "Mickey" Steins stands across from him. For nearly a minute, the two men appear engaged in what could have been a standard courthouse conversation. Nothing in the opening frames suggests the violence that was about to unfold. Then, the atmosphere shifts. Steins reaches inside his jacket, his movements quick and deliberate. In a matter of seconds, he produces a handgun. Judge Mullins rises, startled, but the response comes too late. The muzzle flashes, the judge collapses, and the room, once a symbol of law and stability, is transformed into a crime scene. The absence of audio made interpretation crucial. Prosecutors insisted the footage revealed planning and intention. Steins did not stumble upon violence. He carried a weapon into the chambers, waited for his moment, and executed his plan. His posture, steady aim, and repeated shots were cited as proof of deliberation. The defense countered with a different narrative. Without audio, they argued, the jury could not know the words exchanged. They suggested that a heated confrontation could have escalated suddenly, pushing Steins into a moment of fear or loss of control. To them, the silence of the video left room for reasonable doubt about premeditation. For jurors, the footage was unavoidable. It forced them to confront the crime directly, stripped of rhetoric or speculation. Every frame captured the irreversible act, leaving the courtroom silent each time it was replayed. From the very start of the trial, prosecutors framed the killing of Judge Kevin Mullins as an act of cold-blooded murder. Their central argument was simple yet devastating. Sean "Mickey" Steins, a former sheriff, had deliberately planned and carried out the execution of a sitting judge. To them, this was not a crime of passion, but one of intent, calculation, and betrayal. The foundation of their case rested on the surveillance footage. Prosecutors replayed the video again and again, urging jurors to look closely at the sequence of movements. They emphasized how Steins entered the chambers armed, how he stood with composure, and how he drew his weapon with precision. Every frame, they argued, was evidence that the crime was deliberate. The multiple shots fired, even after Judge Mullins had collapsed, were presented as proof of determination to end the judge's life. Beyond the footage, the state relied heavily on motive. They pointed to years of tension between Steins and Mullins, citing disputes that had left the former sheriff humiliated and resentful. Testimony from colleagues and community members described the decline of Steins's reputation, financial troubles, and professional disappointments, all of which prosecutors said fueled a desire for revenge. This was not, they argued, an explosion of sudden anger, but the culmination of bitterness harbored over time. Prosecutors also underscored the symbolism of the act. By killing a judge in his own chambers, Steins was not only taking a life, but also striking at the very heart of justice. They told jurors that the crime represented a profound betrayal of public trust, as the man once sworn to uphold the law had turned his weapon against its most visible representative. The emotional core of the state's case came from the family of Judge Mullins. His daughters, seated just a few feet from the jury, embodied the cost of the crime. When called to testify, they spoke not only of their father's dedication to the law, but of the void his absence left in their lives. Their quiet strength reinforced the prosecution's narrative of loss and injustice. At every turn, the state pressed the jury to see the crime as premeditated murder. They argued that Steins had options. He could have walked away, sought help, or chosen restraint, but instead, he chose violence. In their view, the evidence was overwhelming, the motive undeniable, and the intent crystal clear. While the prosecution painted a picture of deliberate and premeditated murder, the defense fought to reframe the tragedy as something far less calculated. Their central argument was that Sean "Mickey" Steins did not enter Judge Mullins' chambers with murder on his mind. Instead, they claimed the shooting was the result of an emotionally charged confrontation that spiraled out of control. The defense seized on the one aspect of the evidence that left room for interpretation: the silent video footage. Without audio, they argued, no one could know exactly what words were exchanged between the judge and the former sheriff in those final moments. To them, the absence of sound created uncertainty, opening the door to reasonable doubt. What if Judge Mullins had provoked or threatened Steins during the exchange? What if emotions, already heightened by years of personal conflict, reached a breaking point that clouded Steins' judgment? Defense attorneys reminded jurors that Steins had spent years as a respected sheriff, a man trusted by his community and dedicated to public service. They asked, would a man with such a history truly plan to assassinate a sitting judge in broad daylight inside a courthouse filled with cameras? Instead, they painted the act as reckless and impulsive. Horrific, yes, but not deliberate murder. Character witnesses were called to humanize the defendant. Friends and former colleagues described him as a man who had once been admired, someone who cared deeply about his county, and who had devoted much of his life to law enforcement. His fall from grace, they argued, had been swift and painful, leaving him vulnerable, frustrated, and emotionally unstable. The defense also tried to reframe motive. Yes, there had been tension between Steins and Judge Mullins, they admitted, but disputes in a courthouse are not uncommon. Heated arguments, professional disagreements, even rivalries. These, they said, are part of the justice system. To leap from conflict to premeditated murder, they insisted, required more proof than the prosecution had provided. In their closing appeals, the defense urged the jury to see Steins as a flawed man who made a catastrophic mistake, not a calculating killer. They argued for manslaughter rather than murder, framing the incident as a tragic outburst fueled by anger, fear, and wounded pride. For the defense, this trial was not just about the death of Judge Mullins, but about whether one moment of rage should define an entire life. When the courtroom doors finally closed and the jury retreated to deliberate, the weight of the case settled heavily on their shoulders. They had been shown hours of testimony, emotional appeals, and the haunting replay of the surveillance footage. Now, away from the eyes of the public, 12 individuals had to reach a decision that would determine Sean "Mickey" Steins' fate. Reports later revealed that deliberations began with sharp divisions. Some jurors were immediately convinced by the prosecution's framing of premeditation. To them, the sight of Steins entering the judge's chambers with a firearm was undeniable proof of intent. They pointed to the deliberate nature of his movements and the repeated shots as clear indicators that this was not an accident or an impulsive outburst. Others, however, hesitated. They echoed the defense's argument that the lack of audio left too many unanswered questions. What words had been exchanged? Could a sudden escalation born out of anger or fear have pushed Steins into a moment of rash violence rather than calculated murder? For these jurors, the silence of the footage was difficult to ignore.
The group wrestled with these questions for hours. They weighed character testimony, community history, and the credibility of witnesses. They considered whether Stein's reputation as a former sheriff was a reason to grant him the benefit of the doubt, or a reason to hold him to an even higher standard of accountability.
Eventually, consensus began to form. The overwhelming factor was the video itself. Even without sound, the imagery was stark. Jurors noted that Steins had time to walk away, time to de-escalate, time to choose another path. Instead, he drew his weapon and fired. The repeated shots left many feeling that hesitation or self-defense could not reasonably explain the act. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. As the four-person stood, silence gripped the room. The verdict was read. Guilty of first-degree murder. Gasps rippled through the gallery while the family of Judge Mullins clutched one another in quiet relief. Steins, once a respected lawman, now faced the reality of spending the rest of his life behind bars. The verdict brought closure for some, devastation for others, and left the entire community reflecting on how justice had been both served and scarred in the same breath. After the guilty verdict was delivered, the trial shifted into its final stage, sentencing. This phase carried its own gravity as the courtroom once again filled with family members, reporters, and community residents eager to see how the justice system would handle one of its own turned criminal. The prosecution pressed for the maximum penalty, arguing that the murder of a sitting judge represented one of the gravest betrayals imaginable. They reminded the court that Sean "Mickey" Steins was not an ordinary defendant. He was a former sheriff who had sworn an oath to protect the public and uphold the law. By turning his weapon on Judge Mullins, they said, he had desecrated that oath and sent shockwaves of fear throughout the community. Anything less than life in prison, prosecutors argued, would cheapen the value of the judge's life and erode confidence in the justice system. The defense, in contrast, made a final plea for leniency. They emphasized Stein's long career in law enforcement, his prior service to the community, and the emotional struggles that had preceded the crime. They did not excuse his actions, but urged the court to consider his humanity, framing him as a man who had lost control rather than a monster beyond redemption. During the sentencing hearing, the most powerful moments came from the victim's family. Judge Mullins' daughters spoke directly to the court, their voices steady yet filled with grief. They described their father's dedication to fairness, his love for his family, and the irreplaceable void his death had left. Their words underscored the devastation Steins had caused, not just to them, but to the wider community. When the judge finally delivered the sentence, the decision was clear: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The ruling was met with quiet solemnity. For the Mullins family, it offered closure. For the community, it served as a stern reminder that no one, no matter their title or past service, stands above the law. The sentencing of Sean "Mickey" Steins sent shockwaves far beyond the courthouse walls. In the immediate aftermath, reactions poured in from every corner of the community, raw, emotional, and often deeply divided. For many, the verdict and life sentence represented justice finally delivered. Residents who had long admired Judge Mullins viewed the outcome as a powerful affirmation that violence against public servants could never be tolerated. Local leaders and legal professionals emphasized that the court had upheld its responsibility, proving that no one was immune from accountability, not even a former sheriff. Vigils were held outside the courthouse, where supporters lit candles in honor of Judge Mullins' legacy.
But not everyone saw the trial's conclusion in the same light. Steins, despite his crime, still had allies in the community. Some former colleagues and lifelong friends struggled to reconcile the man they once knew, a decorated sheriff, father, and community leader, with the image of a convicted murderer. To them, the trial had stripped away the complexity of his character, reducing him to a single, catastrophic act. Their voices called for compassion, questioning whether life without parole was too severe for someone who had once dedicated decades to law enforcement.
Local media amplified these divides, with talk radio shows and editorial pages buzzing with debate. Was the sentence an act of justice or an act of vengeance? Did the trial expose the strength of the legal system or its blind spots? Social media, too, became a battleground, with residents passionately defending one side or the other. At the heart of the public reaction was a broader sense of loss. The community mourned not just Judge Mullins, but also the trust shattered by a former lawman's betrayal. Many wondered aloud how two figures who had once symbolized law and order could collide in such a violent and tragic way. Ultimately, the trial became more than just a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning for a county forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Trust in public institutions, the fallibility of heroes, and the fragility of justice were all laid bare. Even as the courtroom doors closed, the echoes of the case continued to shape public conversation, ensuring that neither Judge Mullins nor Sean Steins would ever be forgotten. The trial of Sean "Mickey" Steins did more than determine the fate of one man. It raised difficult questions about the justice system, the weight of public trust, and the vulnerability of institutions meant to protect society. At its core, this case was not only about a murder, but also about what happens when the guardians of law and order become its violators. One of the most pressing implications centered on accountability. Steins was a former sheriff, someone who had worn the badge, enforced the law, and earned the trust of his community. His conviction sent a clear message: authority does not grant immunity. For many, this was a reassurance that the legal system could rise to the occasion, holding even its most powerful members to the same standards as ordinary citizens. Yet, the trial also exposed how fragile that trust can be. Had there been no video evidence, some wondered, would justice have been served at all? The case also underscored the importance of transparency in public institutions. The release of the surveillance footage, despite its haunting nature, was critical in shaping both the trial and public perception. Without it, the defense's narrative of uncertainty may have gained more traction. The footage became a symbol of how technology can provide clarity in moments otherwise clouded by conflicting testimonies. However, it also sparked debate about privacy, the ethical limits of public exposure, and the emotional toll such evidence takes on victims' families. Another implication lay in the psychological pressures faced by those in positions of authority. Steins's fall from respected sheriff to convicted murderer raised concerns about the unspoken stresses that accompany public service. Could more robust mental health support or intervention have prevented this tragedy? The case fueled discussions about how unchecked personal struggles, anger, pride, isolation, can escalate into irreversible violence when combined with access to weapons and authority. Finally, the trial reignited national conversations about the sanctity of the judiciary. A sitting judge, targeted and killed in his own chambers, represented an attack not just on one man, but on the very foundation of the justice system. The ruling reinforced the principle that violence against public officials is an assault on democracy itself. In the end, the broader implications of the Steins trial stretched far beyond a single courtroom. It was a sobering reminder that justice requires constant vigilance, that trust is both invaluable and fragile, and that even those sworn to protect society can sometimes be its greatest threat. As the echoes of the trial began to fade, what lingered most was the profound sense of tragedy. Two men who had once embodied the ideals of justice, a respected judge and a former sheriff, became forever linked in a story defined by betrayal, violence, and loss. Judge Mullins, remembered for his fairness and dedication, became a symbol of integrity cut short. Sean "Mickey" Steins, once celebrated for his service, will now be remembered as the man who shattered that integrity in the most devastating way possible. The case serves as a chilling reminder of how quickly power and trust can unravel. In a single act, Steins not only destroyed his own legacy, but also inflicted irreparable harm on the community he once swore to protect. The shock of his betrayal underscored the vulnerability of the very institutions people rely on to uphold law and order. Yet within the darkness of the case, there were glimmers of resilience. The trial itself, thorough, transparent, and unflinching, showed that the justice system can hold even its former enforcers accountable. The courage of Judge Mullins' family, who spoke with grace and strength during sentencing, demonstrated how personal grief can be transformed into a call for justice. And the public conversation that followed, though painful, revealed a community unwilling to look away from hard truths. In the end, the story of Judge Mullins and Sean Steins is not just about crime and punishment. It is about the fragility of trust, the weight of accountability, and the enduring need to safeguard the principles of justice. The memory of Mullins will live on as a reminder of integrity and service. The downfall of Steins will stand as a warning of what happens when pride, anger, and betrayal overwhelm duty. Together, their story leaves behind a cautionary legacy, one that compels us to reflect not only on the tragedy itself, but also on the responsibility each of us bears in protecting the ideals of justice and truth.